crops in southern Africa, and priceless cultural artifacts threatened by flooding in Paris. Nor would the enemy fight within the legal conventions of war. The biological warfare and psychological terror wrought by Zika was proof enough. Worse still, the greed, ignorance, and complacency of our own leadership has permitted and even willed each and every one of us to support and fund the frequency and intensity of these attacks. We choose, writes McKibben, to strengthen the enemy with our endless combustion. A billion explosions of a billion pistons inside a billion cylinders have fueled a global threat as lethal as a mushroom-shaped nuclear explosion we long feared. Carbon and methane now represent the deadliest enemy of all time. The first force fully capable of harrying, scattering, and impoverishing our entire civilization. Now, McKibben was quick to stress that his language was not rhetorical or metaphorical. The war on climate change is not simply a way of marshaling political will and force like the war on drugs, the war on poverty, or the war on cancer. By most of the ways we measure war, says McKibben, climate change is the real deal. Carbon and methane are seizing physical territory, sowing havoc and panic, racking up casualties, and even destabilizing governments. It's not that global warming is like a world war, it is a world war. And while its first victims have been the least deserving, it's a world war, he stressed, that is aimed at all of us. As McKibben sums, World War III is well and truly underway, and we are losing. Now, leveraging fear and terror have always been essential aspects of McKibben's rhetoric. For the former Sunday school teacher, ecological collapse is the fire and brimstone that marks the necessity of social reconstruction. Yet, a world at war does not contain McKibben's standard solutions, which normally read, as one New York Times columnist quipped, like a list of things white people like. Vegetarianism, farmers markets, awareness, and making others feel bad for not going outside. This time, McKibben aggressively argues for the kind of strong and centralized government he had deemed all but impossible in the past. In keeping with the projections produced by Stanford's Atmosphere and Energy Program, in the summer of 2016, it was still possible for the United States to generate at least 80% of its power from wind, solar, and water by 2030. Yet to do so would require acts of political will and solidarity so exceedingly grand that they seemed categorically unprecedented. Except, as McKibben reminds the reader, there is a precedence. With the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the American political landscape changed over the course of a day. Though the means of production may have already been in place, the Japanese invasion had made individual Americans willing to do hard things, pay more taxes, buy war bonds, and endure shortages and economic disruptions as the nation transitioned towards a war economy. McKibben's refrain is as powerful as it is simplistic. If Americans want to win World War III, they need only look to the examples set by the previous Great War. As argued by historian Mark Wilson, beyond the frontline conflicts that dominate the popular imagination, what determined American victory in World War II was a particular and largely ephemeral association between the federal government and private corporations. Leveraging his control of Congress, Franklin Roosevelt creates a litany of new governmental agencies. For instance, the War Production Board and the Defense Plant Corporation, that in turn spend over $9 billion of public funds building and tooling factories that are then leased to private firms. Logistics and supply chain management was given over to the military as they aggressively created and canceled contracts to optimize production to meet the needs of the war effort. Profit controls were initiated, and companies that didn't comply found their factories seized. In sum, what wins World War III is the efficient production and distribution of material combined with private and public interests unified and rapidly mobilized against a common enemy. Now, it's difficult to miss the appeal of McKibben's argument. Or for that matter, how the narrative attempts to quell the growing divisiveness within the Democratic Party. Effectively diffusing the economic argument against green energy, McKibben draws on a nostalgic version of nationalism to display a modern revolution in economic policy and political systems that changed the face of the nation in a matter of years. While the perceived newness of these technologies may foster uncertainty, in reality they are grounded on the American base. Green militarization that's a Freudian slip. Militarization will require factories, skilled labor, an educated class of technicians, engineers, bureaucrats, and a strong federal government to build public corporations. Preservationist interests will need to identify the science, design, and technology capable of providing safe modes of adaptation. The chasm that separates the labor and environmental movements must be crossed. Climate action must equalize the gap between centers of global capital and the impoverished core of middle America. Governments and economies need to work for the humans and non-humans that compose them. Issues of race, gender, and class need to be prioritized to ensure that those that are least responsible are not forced to shoulder the worst of the consequences. And for posterity, McKibben warned that post-war mistakes need not be repeated. The glut of domestic consumption, the rise of big business, and the privatization of military production. Moreover, while the call to war was a plea for solidarity and commitment among actors, given McKibben's central position within the Sanders campaign, it was also a failed attempt at unifying the increasingly fragmented Democratic Party. On one hand, supporting Hillary Clinton's late attempt to adopt a climate change policy, McKibben's endorsement suggested to Sanders supporters that radical change was in fact possible from within established political dynasties. On the other hand, given that McKibben is voicing his support for Clinton, not to mention his fear of Trump, it's hard not to see the rhetoric of securitization and militarization as a means of appeasing Clinton's existing base. Once popular environmentalism figures green energy through the logic of war, whether conventional or unconventional, it harmonizes all too well with the Clintons' own brand of militarization, something like a horrific hybrid between Bill Clinton's The National Security Strategy of Engagement and Enlargement and the National Defense Authorization Act, and the Clinton Foundation's green capitalism. Though McKibben would stress economic gain should be limited and profiteering brought to a halt, given this convergence of forces, it is nearly impossible to imagine how climate war under the Clinton administration could have been anything else other than a series of multi-colonial free market ventures that sought to expand the logic of American securitization vis-a-vis a hegemonic grand strategy. Sorry. Now, certainly all of this is pretty much meaningless because Hillary never won. And you guys are left in a completely different situation. Though I do think it still speaks to a certain tendency that is present in the popular environmentalism. See, McKibben has always had a penchant for the construction of normative dualisms. This begins in 1989 with his publication of The End of Nature, and I'm going to pain you guys with some of the passages from this. I'm sorry, I know we've all read them 1,000 times and they hurt. But I'm a humanist, so I need to have my textual basis covered. On the one hand, the a priori or pure nature of the Adirondacks. On one hand, the a priori or pure nature of the Adirondacks, the woods that swallow McKibben up in his daily hikes, or the Kettle Lakes he kind of talks about swimming in. Nature is, as McKibben describes, another separate, timeless, wild sphere. Nature as some inhuman place. On the other hand, there is the anthropogenic, or that which ends nature, the snarl of a chainsaw that drives out the forest's timeless meaning, or the blue smoke of boats returning the swimmer's mind to body. A wilderness of litter and stumps and paths with man ever present. Or, more powerfully still, a nature fundamentally changed by a pervasive chemical blight and unthinkable amounts of carbon. A nature categorically reordered in both its ontological and existential registers. Moreover, it's a similar refrain that is deployed by 2010's Earth. While the old Earth, writes McKibben, existed in a 10,000-year-old climatic sweet spot, warm enough to free arable land from ice and snow, but still cold enough that glacier melt provided irrigation and drinking water to the plains. By McKibben's description, the original Earth was the correct temperature for the marvelously diverse planet that seems to be right to us. It was insane, he goes on, he'll say, it's insanely abundant and fecund, a grand oasis. It was predictable, but more importantly, what he wants to stress here is that the old Earth was secure. This is no longer the reality of his new, uncanny Earth, the Earth with two A's. Human activity has transformed that Earth. We have sabotaged its biology, drained its diversity, changed the context of life in an ongoing attempt to run Genesis backwards through a systematic process of decreation. While the Earth may appear Earth-like, the sun still rises and the sky is still blue, Ours is a profoundly different planet, one that is changing in incalculable ways, bereft of stability and marred by insecurity. Now, in large part, both expressions represent an exceedingly common interpretation of the Frankfurt School's early domination thesis and how this was so central to the development of early environmental thought throughout the 70s, 80s, and up to the 90s. Albeit one that preferred to condemn the advancement of reason's domination of nature while repressing the ways in which a developmental evolution of nature and enlightenment had spawned the notion of a modern nature that was becoming inseparable from totalitarian violence. In essence, there was always the environmentalism of this time, especially with deep ecology and critical ecology, wanted to use the domination thesis, and they wanted to say that reason and subjectivity was bad, but they didn't want to adopt that later part of the dialectic where nature comes back as totalitarian violence, as a mythic force. They didn't like that part so much, so they just dropped it. Rather fittingly then, when McKibben attempts to envision a practical means of resisting the domination thesis, it tends to confirm the very imminent reversal that Horkheimer and Adorno feared. You see, with a world at war, while the gentle cause behind ecological change is still undeniably linked to human objectification and instrumentalization, this figure becomes latent to the essay. McKibben's universal we is largely suspended, now favoring a presentation that manifests culpability through the figures of carbon, methane, and the natural laws definitive of both. Paraphrasing McKibben, with the death of the old providential earth, what remains is a new life form as powerful and inexorable as the law of physics, and completely indifferent to the lives and desires and economies threatened by the proliferation of its existence. Carbon is not sentient or evil, and it doesn't hold us in contempt, but it will still nonetheless wage war. There are at least 3 points that can be drawn from this posture, all of which I think are ingrained in the deep spectrum of ecological politics. First, McKibben's reconstitution of the normative binary between first and second nature attempts to challenge the stagnation of liberal democratic politics by invoking a distinction between friend and enemy that is largely inseparable from the decisionism of Carl Schmitt. Nor is this tendency unknown within deep ecology. Speaking at a point in time when France's Leveaux were enacting a series of internal policy reforms similar to those of the current Front National, Jean-François Léotard noted similar concerns. For Léotard, ecological politics were beginning to resemble Carl Schmitt's humanism of war. Ecology was becoming what he called the ecologism of war. Politics is the autonomous differentiation of friend from enemy and the creation of the state through a shared acknowledgement of public enmity. Thus, for politics to reach its high point, the enemy must be recognized through the concrete clarity of conflict and ultimately combat. Furthermore, to maintain this enemy is to maintain the possibility of war. In Schmitt's words, war follows from enmity. This does not mean, as Schmitt stressed, that war need to be common, normal, ideal, or even desirable, only that the constitution of the political demanded the real potential for war. In this way, the state is reborn, freed from the anti- or post-political cultural liberal democracies that understand the citizen as existing in a private sphere removed from the state, by instituting a constant state of crisis and antagonism that necessitates an ongoing and continual organization of political struggle. The citizen realizes themselves as a political actor by committing themselves to the existential negation of an enemy, and ultimately by abandoning the illusion of peace and well-being for the logic and mechanics of war, sacrifice, and elimination. Thus, for Schmitt, politics emerge, as Paul Kahn phrases it, when there is a willingness to kill and be killed. So while McKibben's war may be circumscribed as an expression of economic warfare, any and every expression of war is inseparable from an epistemological horizon that understands the subject through the self-sacrifice and suspension of life. McKibben wants to disrupt political ennui to demand every individual become a political subject, but more so that every subject become a soldier willing to both concede their own life while agreeing to take life. Or perhaps more latently, the notion of climate war reorders climate politics as a system that is primarily negotiating the terms of life and death. Second, and relatedly, McKibben's climate war wants to figure carbon as a valid enemy, and as such, a valid historical agent. This, of course, I think as Jason has worked out, is not true. and I think to some extent McKibben would concede. The appeal of placing the blame on carbon, no, I missed some slides, apologies. The point, I think, is that, the appeal of placing blame on carbon and methane is that it tends to remove the onus of guilt that is thought to limit engagement with environmental issues. At the same time, the style of abstraction tends to limit, as Jason Moore has argued, the perception that climate is deeply reticulated matrix of nature and culture. McKibben may not play into the idea of the Anthropocene, but he's also not willing to address the capital scene, either in its old guise as petroculture or in its latest expression as green capitalism. Furthermore, by dehumanizing the enemy as an objective set of laws or causal principles, McKibben tends to play into the idea that this war can be total. Indeed, that if we are to win, it must be total. More troubling still, by suggesting that an abstract notion of carbon and methane as self-contained or pure objects, he tends to renew the objectification, instrumentalization, and domination that critical ecology has always positioned itself against. As a pure object, the enemy is insentient, indifferent, or unthinking, to be fought and dominated without ethical concern. For McKibben, the war against carbon is not simply a matter of challenging the logic that constructs nature as pure objectivity in order to legitimize its domination, but rather a means of redeeming and legitimizing its various practices as modes of restorative or sacred violence. In this way, the war to preserve life manifests itself by marginalizing a more expansive notion of material life. Third, once it is established what McKibben is fighting against, it is helpful to ask beyond the obvious what he is trying to defend. With the publication of Earth, it is already clear to McKibben that there will be no going back to nature. That moment has passed. Nor do I think the answer McKibben does give fully encapsulates the whole of the truth, i.e., we fight to preserve what semblance of the old order is left. What McKibben is fighting for is a principle. In keeping with the transcendentalist lineage that spans from Emerson to Wendell Berry, McKibben's nature is not grounded in the primacy of a synthetic duplicity, but rather through an epistemological remainders of a substantial, dynamic, vital, or organic monism, i.e., when McKibben is being candid, the principle of limited creation is God. The irony is that this naturalized notion of creativity is largely inseparable from the logic of productivity inherent to capitalism. Both vitalistic nature and capitalism want to project itself as a self-contained piece of infinity, a never-ending flow of productivity unlimited by space and time. It is absolute, it is eternal, it is therefore inescapable and permanent. It is ahistorical. Thus, this nature is in principle out of time and thus unaffected by the flux of history, economies, and social organization. Furthermore, it's also a developmental principle that tends to confirm McKibben's reinscription of a consumptive domination thesis. Dynamic nature, as Adorno names it, bourgeois nature, projects a conception of unfettered activity, uninterrupted procreation, a never-ending insatiability that seeks to realize something through its unlimited development. I don't really have a conclusion for this, other than to say the idea was that I wanted to talk about how we might go about unmaking the conception of enmity. And I think that maybe in Jason's conception of the oikos, there was something like that there. The synthetic matrix of the oikos, as he presents it, is one thing, but we also have this historical presentation of the oikos, where it is kind of this duplicity. It is the home, it is being, it is a nature, but it's also a site of tragedy. It's a site of violence. It's the place where you run your domestic economy by owning slaves. It's also the rule of the hand that allows you to enter into the polis, the rule of the voice. And I think that ambiguity in the oikos is really quite powerful. It doesn't mean that the enemy is outside, and it doesn't mean the enemy is within us, but it means that we're always negotiating a presence of violence. So that was something. Okay, thank you.
So if folks want to come up, I'm sorry, there's no chairs. Or we could turn around, but if you wanted to grab yours.
Oh.
I will. We have 15 minutes, so we actually have some good time, and I will field questions. Maybe I'll do 2 or 3 at once.
Okay, Don, I'm Sam. I have 2 questions, one for each of the speakers, so I'll just battle them off pretty quickly here.
The thing is, like, on the one hand, I feel like I totally agree with, like, everything in your article and everything that you presented. But at the same time, I kind of feel like there is, like, a mass violence approaching, and we need a mass transformation that needs to be, like, political and economic, and needs to take into account capitalism, everything. And given that, like, I'm curious what the role of fear has, and I don't think fear is always leads to authoritarianism or leads to, and I like want to think about that, and because I personally know many people